I remember when I was working as a research assistant with the Sea Turtle Conservancy in Tortuguero National Park in Costa Rica. Now, this place is home to one of the largest green turtle nesting beaches in the world. We're talking about hundreds of turtles coming up to nest every night. And each night, our job was to go out onto the beach to find, tag, and collect data from as many nesting turtles as we could. But when you have this much activity up on the beach, it attracts other kinds of attention. I remember one specific night I was on a survey with a friend of mine. Shout out to Helen, if you ever listen to this. Um, and we had found a turtle that had just started laying her eggs, so it was go time. This is when we can collect our data. So I tagged her flippers and I started to take her carapace measurements. When all of a sudden, Helen tells me to stand up. And I've got my hands full measuring this massive 1.5 meter long turtle. So I just look at her and I'm like, what do you mean stand up? Then she tells me again to stand up right now. And I look to where she's pointing her light, and no more than 10 meters away is a fully grown jaguar stood there just watching us. Now, for 2 seconds, both of us are holding our breath. No one's moving a muscle. And let me tell you that this felt like the longest 2 seconds of my life. Time essentially stood still. I could literally hear my heart beating in my ears. And then suddenly the jaguar just turns around and scurries into the forest. And it's exactly moments like this that are exactly why I love working with sea turtles, because they don't just exist in isolation. They have a really important role in these complex, interconnected ecosystems, both on land and in the ocean. And that's why I care deeply about protecting them.
Wow, that story is just mad. Welcome to Ocean Unpacked, your one-stop shop to get the latest in ocean news and marine research, along with some amazing facts about the incredible life in our seas. With me, Greg Holder, science communicator and shark lover.
And me, Julian Javelino, marine scientist and sea turtle biologist.
Awesome. So today we are obviously focusing on turtles, sea turtles particularly. So yeah, I've just got to start off, Julian. You're the expert in it. Why turtles?
Well, for me, it was never something that I always wanted to do. It wasn't an animal that I always wanted to work with. It was just, I remember after I'd finished my bachelor's, I wanted to, try my hand at wildlife conservation. And turtles was always something that was so accessible because they exist, all over the planet. And I remember when I first worked in my first NGO as a research assistant, seeing these turtles, these massive ancient creatures that have been in the oceans for 110 million years, seeing one of them just kind of crawl up the beach to lay eggs directly in the sand, it had me in a complete trance, and I completely fell in love with these animals. And they're incredible, incredible creatures that they exist all across the oceans, and they have this incredible way to navigate huge distances between the areas where they're foraging and where they're resting and the areas where they're laying the eggs. So just really amazing creatures. And I've been working with them for about 4 to 5 years now, and that kind of wonder still hasn't really gone away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most amazing things about turtles is that they are just prehistoric, right? Like you said, I remember seeing a leatherback turtle coming up on the beach,
Oh yeah.
and seeing any turtle even in the water is spectacular, but seeing the biggest turtle and it being out of water, you do literally look at it and you're like, that's a dinosaur.
I mean,
It's
it
the same
doesn't
awe that you get with
it doesn't look
crocodiles.
like something that should exist.
No,
It just
especially
looks
not with that mouth,
alien.
those weird pointy teeth fork things. It's kind of mad, but they naturally are awe inspiring. I think that's why we both of us were in the Maldives for 3 years. I probably think the most common animal that was sort of requested or hoped to see was turtles, because they're this incredibly beautiful, interesting, but mysterious animal that a lot of people love to see wherever they are in the world.
Yeah, no, they're really charismatic animals. I mean, if you chat to anyone, most people you talk to absolutely love turtles. And one of the things that they'll say is that because they're so cute, especially when you look at little baby turtles. You have that image of them like running down the beach, scurrying down the beach, and getting into the ocean. I think that's what makes a lot of people fall in love with turtles. And
Absolutely.
you know, even though they are such charismatic species, even though they are such beloved species, they are also some of the most endangered animals on the planet. Over the last
Mm.
50, 60 years, we've seen their populations absolutely plummet from human influences, from human threats like commercial fishing, threats like plastic pollution and plastic debris, beach development, um, bycatch, and um, very importantly, climate change. That's having a massive impact on turtles, and it's something that I've seen in a lot of the places I've worked at. We see a lot of beaches now that are essentially getting washed away from these rising tides and these storm surges. You're seeing nests that are having these imbalance in sex ratios, because for those that are listening that don't know, the sex of a turtle is determined by the temperature of the sand. So when you get warmer temperatures, you actually get more female turtles being produced in the nest. And when you have cooler temperatures, you get more males being produced. So when you have this rise in temperature brought about by climate change, it's causing this massive imbalance in sex ratios. And it's something that's being seen kind of all over the world. So, like I said, even though they are such beloved, charismatic animals, they still are a species that requires a lot of protection and a lot of conservation.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons we want to talk about them in today's episode, is to highlight some of the incredible features of turtles, definitely, but also to highlight that they are endangered, they are declining generally around the world, and we need to continue working towards protection of them on a small scale and obviously on a wide scale. Of course, there is loads of research already done on turtles, which is brilliant. Really helps to build that argument for protection of them. And in our podcast, we always want to be highlighting some of the most interesting and relevant research that's come out come out recently, and sort of dissecting it for listeners so that they can understand some of the most interesting and recent research on these topics. So, Julian, you're the turtle guy. What turtle research do you have for us today?
Well, the thing about turtles is that there's always a lot of papers and a lot of research coming out on them. So we're always learning new things. Even though we've been studying them for years and years and years, there's still a lot of things we don't understand about them, especially when they're in the ocean.
But Julian, they're always in the ocean.
But that's my exact point. They spend most of their lives in the ocean, but they only ever come up on the beach to lay their eggs. But most of research that's happened in the last 50, 60 years have focused on the beaches, because that's where people can get to. That's where it's easy to study them. But more and more research in the last couple of decades is coming out about turtles in the water. And I actually saw this paper that was published last year by the University of Central Florida, looking at the sea turtle behavior during the lost years. Now, for those people that are listening that don't know what the lost years is, it's a stage in a sea turtle's life right after they hatch from their nest and enter the ocean. So what happens is that when they exit the nest and they crawl into the ocean, what most hatchlings do is that they swim away from the coast, from the reefs, where you're getting a lot of these big fish and sharks that are predating on them in shallow waters. And they swim out to these open ocean currents to essentially get caught and drift in these open ocean currents for about 3 to 5 years, depends on the species. But when they reach these open ocean currents, it's extremely to actually track them and to see what's going on in this stage of their life. That's why we call them the lost years, because people don't really see where these turtles go. A lot of research has come out shedding light on what happens during these lost years, but there was actually one that came out more recently where they placed tiny satellite trackers on over 100 wild-caught juvenile sea turtles off the Gulf of Mexico. Now, a satellite tracker, what that does, it gives us really, really precise information on where the turtles are moving within their ocean habitats, right? And with the development of technology, we're able to make smaller and smaller and smaller satellite trackers so that we can now actually start putting some of these trackers on these tiny juvenile turtles and learning about them during our quote unquote lost years.
Mm.
So in this study, they essentially place satellite trackers on over 100 different juvenile sea turtles when they enter this lost years phase. And they actually found that they weren't just going out into the open ocean and getting caught in these ocean currents like you see in Finding Nemo, when they go into the EAC and you just see all these turtles kind of riding this roller coaster of a current around the ocean.
Mm.
So that's not actually what happens according to the
Oh,
study. So they,
don't ruin the dream.
I'm sorry, I've
The
got a
dream
lot
of
of
the
qualms.
EAC.
I've got a lot of qualms with what they say about turtles in Finding Nemo.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
I'm not going to bring that up. I don't want to start any fights. Um, but at least in this study, they actually find that these juvenile sea turtles aren't just drifting out in the open ocean, but they actually swim between the deep ocean areas and continental shallow water areas. So they kind of move between these two areas. Um, and it really challenges our understanding of the lost years because it's not so simple as that they completely leave the coasts and the continental shallow waters and go out into the open ocean. They actually will travel between and use these two habitats. And the reason why that's important is because, now that there's another reason to then protect these shallow continental shelves where you generally do get a lot of human activity, whether that's from fishing, recreation, boat traffic. So, it just shows us how much we still have to learn about turtles from such basic parts of their life stages.
Mm.
So it was super interesting. I really enjoyed reading it.
And so, when do you think they're going to rename the Lost Years? Because we can't ride on the Lost Years that much longer if we know what they're doing.
Yeah,
Every movement.
yeah, and I've had a talk with this about some other people who work in sea turtle research that were saying, I feel like the lost years doesn't really apply. Like we kind of we have a pretty good idea of what happens, so
Yeah, yeah.
can't really call it the lost years anymore. Maybe I'll start a petition to get them to change the name of it.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
And do they have any idea why they would be moving? Like, what benefit do they have moving to the continental shelf out to the open ocean? Because obviously they're not, as babies, they're not deep diving. They're staying, as far as I'm aware, in the first few meters of water, really. So what benefit? Or maybe they don't know it. It's such new research. Maybe there's not anything known about it. But why do you think they might be doing this movement? Or does the research show any ideas of why they're doing this?
I mean, at the moment, the research it just kind of shows that they do move between the shallow and deeper waters. There's obviously a lot of kind of theories as to why they do this. This area in the Gulf of Mexico is also overlaps with what we call the Sargasso Sea. So this is where there's a lot of sargassum seaweed, and a lot of these baby turtles are finding shelter in these big patches of seaweed. And so that's why they don't need to dive, because they can essentially have this miniature oasis floating on the ocean surface that they can then hide in and stay around, and then they just kind of feed on whatever they can find. Um, you know, the reasons why they move between the shallow and deeper waters, that is still not known. So that could be something for further research. But generally, they don't stay in very, very shallow waters. For example, they don't stay in the reefs, because when it's that shallow, everything's kind of living close to the surface. So you're under threat from any kind of fish, shark, even birds that can prey on you, that live close to the coasts. So they still will tend to stick towards that deeper water.
Yeah, yeah. And this is still quite incredible research in terms of learning about these lost years that no one knew about for so long. But it just really highlights just how incredible science has become, that we can tag these tiny turtles. Both of us have seen the size of baby turtles and how fragile and light they are. So to have a tracker on one of them that doesn't negatively impact it is quite incredible. It just really shows how science is progressing and opening new doors to understand certain life cycles. This is one of them that just is mind-blowing, that we can do that now, and we're learning about this incredible journey that turtles do right at the start of their life, which is just incredible and just makes them all the more interesting as an animal.
It does, yeah. And for those people that are listening, to give you an idea of the size of these satellite tags, they're about the size of your thumbnail. So they really are absolutely tiny. So not super invasive, but obviously the thing with tagging, juvenile turtles or baby turtles is, and I think this is something that a lot of people know, is that not many of them survive to adulthood. So the
Mm,
general number that we throw around is 1 in 1,000. Baby turtles will survive into adulthood, or 1 in 1,000 eggs will survive into adulthood.
mm.
And so when you are placing these trackers, there's a very good chance that you're losing a lot of these trackers to either big fish or sharks that eat it.
Yeah,
And
I was
so
wondering that.
yeah, but the thing is, it's fine with the data, because as soon as these trackers kind of go inside um, one of these fish or sharks and they're not at the surface, they stop transmitting. So, but no, it is amazing, amazing with the technology that's developed, what we can start to learn
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
about turtles.
absolutely. And so that is a really cool bit of research. We will put the actual research paper. We'll put a link to that in the footnotes so that anyone who wants to can read it. Another thing that we always want to do on this podcast is highlight some of the most interesting news. Because obviously not all science makes the news, and not all news is necessarily a published scientific paper. So we want to try and cover some of the really interesting stories that have come out recently, where they're hopefully positive, mostly positive, hopefully, but obviously we'll cover anything that is of particular interest. And this podcast, we actually have some really cool news that came out at the end of last year, spelling a bit of a hopeful time for turtles, possibly, Julian?
Yeah, and I mean, I was really excited to hear this news. I mean, as someone who obviously has worked in sea turtle conservation for 5 years, um, for those that haven't heard, but I'm pretty sure you will have, because it was really, really big news in the conservation world, was in October last year, green turtles were reclassified from endangered to least concern on the IUCN Global List of Threatened Species. So this is an enormous win for conservation, because these guys, green turtles, have been classified as threatened or endangered for about 50 years. And it's taken huge amounts of conservation effort from researchers, conservationists, communities, storytellers, media, just a monumental mental effort to be able to bring these species back from the brink of extinction. Um, so this assessment was actually coordinated by the IUCN Marine Turtle Specialist Group, which included a network of over 250 scientists, managers, and conservationists worldwide. So again, just kind of highlighting that monumental effort across the world in helping populations of green turtles bounce back. So it is a huge conservation win, a huge
Mm.
conservation win. And as someone who's not, I haven't worked nearly as long as some researchers and some conservationists have in sea turtle conservation, but having dedicated 5 years of my life to it, this is just such an amazing feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. You're part of the solution, Julian. Don't
Thank you, thank you, thank
don't
you.
minimize that.
I'm gonna give myself a little pat on the back.
Absolutely. I think anybody who's listening, if anyone's been involved in turtle conservation or donated to a conservation organization helping turtles, you've all been part of the bigger picture to move these guys from threatened to least concern, which is just a massive win. However, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, and just sort of something that's come up in my mind when this sort of announcement came out. Of course, on the surface, I think, what brilliant news. What worries me though is sort of things going forward. With turtles, green turtles being moved into least concern, is this going to spell almost the end of turtle conservation? Is it going to mean that organizations don't get funding anymore because, hey, who's going to pay to protect a species of least concern? Does it mean that local communities or governments even are going to reduce protection or go back to fishing them or keeping them as bycatch? This is my only worry, is what happens to turtle conservation now? Does it just reverse, and in another 20 years we chuck them back down into threatened because we've just done what humans do best once again and just obliterated the population?
I think that's a very valid concern, and I think that's actually a concern that also everyone has had, and that anyone that has spoken about it has really had to preface this news with that information that because turtles have bounced back because of 50 years of conservation effort, but that doesn't mean that we can now stop protecting them and let their populations fall again. It's also important to note that there are 7 species of turtles and green turtles are the first one that have gone into least concern. You still have turtles like hawksbills and Kemp Ridley turtles that are both still critically endangered. So that is the highest level of threatened classification you can get. You have leatherbacks that in some parts of the ocean, like the East Pacific, are almost completely wiped out from commercial fisheries. And even for green turtles, there are still some green turtle populations in the world, like in parts of the Indian Ocean, that are still in decline or haven't recovered to a kind of healthy population. So the work definitely doesn't stop there. And, you know, the reason, at least from what I understand, is the reason that the populations of green turtles have bounced back is primarily because of protection on nesting beaches. So people stopping the harvest of sea turtle eggs and sea turtles for their meat on these nesting beaches, that's what has had the biggest impact on these populations going up. But you know, there's still other threats that are out there. Threats like plastic pollution, that isn't really letting up. Threats like commercial fishing, that isn't really letting up.
Yeah.
And climate change, which definitely isn't letting up. So, you know, I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and you know, particularly for climate change, although these nesting beaches might be protected and people aren't harvesting the eggs from these nesting beaches anymore, it won't really matter if sea level rise and increased storm surges are then wiping these beaches off the face of the earth. Yeah. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. We cannot take our foot off the pedal. And I think now it's really important to understand how turtles are going to be able to respond to the impacts of climate change on their habitats, both on land and both in the sea.
So just to sort of unpack this bit of news, I guess it's without doubt a massive win, and I think it's one of the biggest success stories in conservation for a long time, particularly in sort of the marine world. So it's great news to hear. But like you said, the work isn't done. It doesn't change the fact that we still have to protect green turtles. We have to protect other turtles, and like you said, we need to be focusing potentially more on the still existential threats to turtles, the ones that are increasing: climate change, fishing pressures, things like that. But it is a brilliant story and proves that conservation works. And I think that's what I like to take away from this, is that it can prove that conservation on a global scale can have an impact. Because sometimes it feels, you know, we've both worked in conservation, it can be hard sometimes to stay motivated because there's a lot of negative news out there. Your own impact can sometimes feel like it is a drop in the ocean and doesn't make a difference. And I just think this story hopefully re-inspires millions to say it does work. Individual action on a massive scale makes a difference and can protect a whole species.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message, because like you said, in conservation, it's very easy to kind of get bogged down in the doom and gloom and the hopelessness of all of it. And so to be able to see this, and it's not just green turtles, you know, the other species have also been able to bounce back from extinction, and it's because of these conservation efforts. So it's important to kind of hold on to that and not lose hope, and know that, as you said, every bit of effort can make that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode today. I hope you have enjoyed learning about turtles, some of the research, and some incredibly exciting news that came out just late last year. And we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.